In the sticky heat of a New York City summer night, a young Debbie Harry slid into the passenger seat of a stranger's white car and instantly sensed something was wrong. The doors had no handles, the windows were rolled almost shut despite the swelter. As the driver accelerated, Harry's heart pounded. She reached through the narrow window crack and with a desperate contortion managed to wrench the door open from the outside. She tumbled out onto the asphalt as the car screeched away. Only years later did she suspect that the man behind the wheel may have been one of the most horrifying figures of the entire 20th century. It was a narrow escape in a life full of them. The woman sprawled on that street, adrenaline surging, skin scraped but free, would soon become a rock icon known to millions. This was Debbie Harry before the fame, survivor of New York's dangers, on the cusp of transforming herself into the peroxide blonde enigma who fronted Blondie and rocked the world with an electric mix of punk, pout and disco groove. A downtown Cinderella who catapulted from gritty clubs to global stardom. But on that night in the early 70s, it could have all come to an early and grisly end. Let's get into the life of the woman a bunch of truckers named Blondie, who went on to change rock music forever. Welcome to Rock and Roll Mysteries. Deborah Ann Harry's story did not begin under the spotlights of New York. Rather, it all started in a quiet corner of 1940s suburbia. She was born Angela Trimble on July 1st, 1945, in Miami, Florida, and at only 3 months old, she was given up for adoption. A loving couple from Hawthorne, New Jersey, Catherine and Richard Harry, proprietors of a gift shop, took her in and renamed her Deborah Ann Harry. Debbie learned the truth about her past as a little girl, and though she didn't try to find her biological parents immediately, the question of her origin lingered in her mind. I guess somewhere in my subconscious, a scene was playing on a loop of a parent leaving me somewhere and never coming back, she would reflect decades later. That fear of abandonment never fully disappeared, even as she grew into a fiercely independent artist. In the late 1980s, Harry did locate her birth mother, a concert pianist who declined to rebuild a relationship with her long-lost daughter. Debbie wasn't surprised. By then she understood that life's twists of fate, even painful ones, were a necessary part of her road. As a child in post-war New Jersey, Debbie was a self-described tomboy who spent afternoons exploring the woods behind her home. There was also an early brush with mortality when she nearly died of pneumonia. The illness even caused her to lapse into a coma, but she recovered. Early signs of fight were clear in her even then. Soon she was growing into a daydreamy teen with an artistic streak, and one other asset that was in truth the most valuable in the image-obsessed mid-20th century, heart-melting beauty. In high school she was voted best looking by her classmates, and compliments of this sort were a round-the-clock occurrence for Debbie. But this was an accolade she met with a detached cool that would later become her trademark. Her looks never inflated her ego. Beneath the pretty exterior was an intelligent and sharp mind drawn to the edgy and unconventional. It's genetic, Harry later said about her inborn creative drive. I was always gonna be an artist, in one field or another, come hell or high water. In fact, in her adoptive mother's piano playing and her own early fascination with music and glamour, one might trace the first notes of a fate that would lead her to such heights. By the late 1960s, after a brief stint at Centenary College, where she earned an Associate of Arts degree, Debbie felt the pull of Manhattan. She moved to New York City in the late 60s, a young woman with bohemian ambitions and a survival instinct sharpened by suburban boredom. The city in those days was a petri dish of counterculture, and Debbie tried on its many guises in search of herself. By day, she worked a demure job as a secretary at the BBC's New York office. This was a rather pragmatic choice that paid the bills for a while. But by night, she slipped into edgier roles. She waitressed at Max's Kansas City, the infamous midtown haunt of artists and rock stars. There, the aspiring singer with mousy brown hair, not yet dyed that signature platinum, served cocktails to luminaries of the era. I was a waitress serving Janis Joplin down in Greenwich Village. Debbie recalled of those days. She was already rubbing shoulders with the famous even while toiling for tips. Few gigs were too odd or risque. She worked for a time as a go-go dancer in New Jersey and even donned the satin ears and cuffs of a Playboy bunny at the New York Playboy Club. She would later chuckle at the absurdity of that job. To Debbie, it was just one of a scrappy roster she cycled through on her way to fame. All the while, she kept singing on the side. She was now nurturing a dream that seemed both inevitable and daringly out of reach. If New York was an education, it also came with hard knocks. In her early 20s, Debbie got into a relationship with a man who became possessive and violent. This was a detour in her life that briefly pulled her out of the city altogether. Feeling disillusioned with her stalled singing career, she moved back to New Jersey and fell in with his volatile boyfriend. One night, in a jealous rage, he broke into her apartment, convinced she was hiding another man. He put a gun to her head and threatened to rape her. That was crazy, wasn't it? Debbie coolly said years later of the incident, almost marveling at her younger self's predicament. She managed to escape unharmed, and rather than let the experience shatter her, she walked away stronger. I was just happy to get away from him and move on with my life, she said simply. Move on she did, straight back to the city that had captured her heart. In 1973, with a renewed determination to make music, Debbie Harry joined a female trio called the Stilettos, a provocative little band that played at downtown clubs. It was in the Stilettos that fate introduced her to a quietly intense young guitarist named Chris Stein. Stein, a Brooklyn native with a mop of dark hair and a head full of artistic dreams, soon became not only a bandmate but a romantic partner. The chemistry between Debbie and Chris was immediate and palpable. Together, they left the Stilettos after only a year and decided to form their own group. This was an endeavor that would define both of their lives. By 1974, they had assembled a lineup and were tinkering with cheeky and, shall we say, cheesily suggestive names like Angel and the Snake. Ultimately, they chose Blondie, a name inspired by the catcalls that delivery truck drivers would hurl at Debbie as she strode the city streets with hair bleached white-yellow like a new coin. Hey, Blondie! The moniker was perfect, simple, sarcastic, feminine yet tough, much like Harry herself. Blondie quickly became a fixture in the bowels of Lower Manhattan's rock scene. At CBGB and Max's Kansas City, the band blasted their songs to audiences who often didn't know what to make of them at first. Debbie cut a striking figure on stage. She was petite but ferocious. With two-toned bottle blonde hair, she'd sometimes dye the underside dark, a kind of punk skunk look, and thrift store outfits held together with safety pins or duct tape. With her beauty and daring fashion, one night a Vulture's t-shirt slashed into ribbons, another night a zebra print mini dress, she was impossible to ignore. Her onstage persona was a fascinating bundle of contradictions. She could stare down a crowd with cool detachment or coo into the microphone like a blonde bombshell from a 50s B-movie. One British journalist described her stage presence in that era as half rock chick, half granny, noting how Debbie could be sweetly self-deprecating 1 minute, then holler like Wanda Jackson the next. The downtown cognoscenti took note of this mesmerizing woman and her motley band of art school punks. Patti Smith and the Ramones were regulars in the same scene. The New York Dolls had been friends of Harry's from her pre-fame days. She had even once driven a van for the Dolls on tour. Blondie's music, with its catchy melodies and Debbie's mercurial persona, didn't immediately scream punk. In truth, their music was too pop for the purists, but they became icons of the new wave that followed. Before I get into the explosive rise of the band, I'd like to remind you all that I have launched a small merch store for the channel. I've only got 3 shirts up at the moment, but the line will be expanding very soon. Marianne Faithfull, Gene Vincent and Graham Parsons are currently on offer, and I think they look quite snazzy. My thanks to those of you who bought one, and I've seen your messages over at the store about how pleased you are with them, and I'm very happy about that. And I'll be adding a few more designs soon. Don't hesitate to let me know who you'd like to see on a shirt. Let's get back to Blondie. By 1976, Blondie had a record deal and released their self-titled debut album. It made a splash in Australia and especially the UK, though America was slower to catch on. The second album, 1978's Plastic Letters, did better, but it was the third album, Parallel Lines, that exploded them into superstar status. Parallel Lines was a perfect storm of new wave rock and radiant late 70s pop. It spawned a song that would become Blondie's signature and a defining anthem of the era, Heart of Glass. Originally a snappy punkish tune in their live set, Heart of Glass was reworked in the studio with a slick disco beat. It sounds obvious now, but this was actually a risky fusion at a time when punk and disco were supposed enemies. The result was magic. Riding the crest of disco's worldwide domination, the track shot to #1 in the US, the UK, and beyond. It sold nearly 2 million copies in the US alone and was the second biggest selling single of 1979 in Britain. One of the other hits from the record was Hanging on the Telephone. If you watched my last episode, you'll know the song was suggested to Debbie by Jeffrey Lee Pierce. Here's how Debbie remembered that moment. We were playing it in the back of a taxicab in Tokyo, and the taxicab driver started tapping his hand on the steering wheel. When we came back to the US, we found that the nerves weren't together anymore, and we said, gee, we should record this. If you did miss the episode all about the tragic downfall of Jeffrey, I'll put a link to it in the description. Blondie suddenly went from cult downtown darlings to mainstream pop stars. In June 1979, the band found themselves on the cover of Rolling Stone, with Debbie Harry's face framed by white blonde hair and a glint of mischief in her eyes, staring out at every newsstand. Overnight, she had become an international sex symbol and trendsetter. Her persona, combining that cool sexuality with her streetwise edge, was so compelling that many casual fans assumed Blondie was the name of the singer, not the group. Debbie and her bandmates pushed back on that misunderstanding by distributing buttons that declared Blondie is a group. But truth be told, even the other band members knew the score. Debbie was the focal point, the avatar through which Blondie's spirit shone. Success only squeezed the band's creative juices into a torrent. Through 1979 and 1980, Blondie churned out hits that traversed genres as if those boundaries did not exist at all. They scored 4 US #1 singles in just 2 years, which was a run virtually unmatched at the time. Among them was Call Me, a galloping rock disco hybrid produced by the Italian maestro Giorgio Moroder for the American Gigolo film soundtrack. That too hit #1 in both the States and the UK. There was The Tide Is High, a swaggering reggae cover that topped charts, and Rapture, a song that made history by bringing hip-hop into the pop spotlight. On Rapture, released in 1981, Debbie rapped playfully about their rapper friend Fab Five Freddy and Flash and meeting a man from Mars who eats cars. These were surreal lines inspired by Chris's love of sci-fi and B-movies. Of course, they were a long way from the deep and gritty nature of black rap that was coming from New York and other places in the late 70s. But it was the first rap song to hit #1, and it introduced broader, even global audiences to the nascent hip-hop scene percolating in New York. Grandmaster Flash himself later said that Debbie, quote, opened up so many doors for hip-hop by championing the scene and name-checking its pioneers. Long before cross-genre collaboration was the norm, Blondie was cutting things up and reforming them as something new. A white female singer in torn stockings and glam makeup giving a shout-out to Black Bronx DJs and MCs, weaving funk and reggae into punky pop. It was, to quote People magazine at the time, a wildly eclectic and even alienating vision of popular culture. Debbie Harry was a musical chameleon. For a girl from New Jersey, already pushing 35, whose breakthrough had come relatively old by pop standards, it was a triumphant validation. At the peak of Blondie's fame, Harry moved through a surreal new world of celebrity. She partied at Studio 54, mingled with fashion designers and punk poets, and became a muse for artists. Andy Warhol, ever drawn to the next big thing, immortalised her in a 1980 portrait series, silk-screening Debbie's face in bold pop art colours like he had done for Marilyn Monroe years before. One of those Warhol portraits, all lips and eyes and yellow hair, would itself become an iconic image of the 80s. I've always been into Andy's stuff, so to be one of his subjects was thrilling, Debbie said of that experience, describing how she and Chris Stein spent a day at Warhol's factory studio, snapping photos and soaking in the artist's peculiar energy. But beyond the glamour lay a darker reality. New York City in the late 70s could be dangerous, and being a rock star didn't exempt Blondie from the city's perils. One night, early in Blondie's climb, Harry and Stein were coming home after a gig when a man followed them into their apartment building. He pulled a knife and forced his way into their home, where he demanded drugs and money. Finding little of either, he tied Chris to a chair and then tied up Debbie, who watched in anger and disbelief as the intruder piled up their guitars and camera, the tools of their trade, to steal. This was nothing compared to what happened next. The man then raped Debbie at knife point before fleeing into the night with their equipment. The trauma of that assault would have left many people shattered. Debbie, remarkably, dealt with it in her own unconventional way. "I can't say that I felt a lot of fear," she later wrote in a line that, frankly, stuns anyone who reads it. "In the end, the stolen guitars hurt me more than the rape." It was a jarring and perhaps defensive assessment of an experience she said she refused to let define her. Decades later, Harry reflected that she hadn't been physically beaten in the incident, and so, in her view, she escaped without lasting harm beyond the emotional and mental fallout. "I was angry and I felt victimized," she admitted, but she determined being a victim was really not who I wanted to be. With Chris's support, she moved on as fast as she could. That was Debbie Harry's way. Absorb the hit, don't show the hurt. Keep moving. It was a coping mechanism forged in a rough world, and it served her through many trials to come. By 1980, Blondie were on top of the world, and at the same time, they were starting to fracture under the weight of that success. The band's fifth album, Auto-American, yielded more hits like the aforementioned Rapture and The Tide Is High. But behind the scenes, tensions were mounting. Fame had magnified personal differences. The relentless schedule of touring and promotion left little room for sanity or rest. Harry, Stein and the others were exhausted. "We worked non-stop for 7 years under extreme pressure," Harry recalled. Drug use was becoming an unspoken part of the routine. Cocaine in dressing rooms, maybe, or heroin back at the hotel. Everybody was taking drugs, Debbie said of that era. That was what was going on. We worked hard and we played hard. By 1981, even as they rode high, Blondie as a unit was beginning to splinter. Debbie took a brief detour to launch a solo project that year, releasing an album called Cuckoo. This was a funky, futuristic experiment produced by Nile Rodgers and Bernard Edwards of the band Chic. The Cuckoo album cover, featuring Debbie's face impaled by stylized steel skewers and H.R. Geiger artwork, was so controversial that some stores refused to stock it. The shock art was a statement. Debbie Harry was not going to be pigeonholed as just the blonde poster girl of a pop band. She was always testing limits. In interviews, Debbie bristled at the media's fixation on her looks. She had posed in a thrifted sleeveless dress for one Blondie poster, only to discover later that the record label had chosen a shot where the dress appeared see-through under bright light. It was a publicity stunt centered on her sexuality that she hadn't approved. "Sex sells, that's what they say. And I'm not stupid, I know that," she said. "But on my terms, not some executives." Then, seemingly all at once, everything fell apart. Blondie's sixth album, 1982's The Hunter, was a flop. The spark seemed to be dimming. During the supporting tour, venues that were packed a year or two earlier now saw empty seats, and dates had to be cancelled for lack of ticket sales. Critics sharpened their knives, calling the album uninspired. Just as worrying, Chris Stein, Debbie's boyfriend and creative other half, was wasting away from a mysterious illness. He was diagnosed with pemphigus, a rare autoimmune disease that causes severe blistering of the skin. The condition was serious, potentially fatal, and Stein's health deteriorated rapidly in 1982. Debbie was terrified for him. In the midst of these crises, Blondie quietly disbanded. There was no dramatic public breakup, just a fizzling out as the band members scattered to tend to their own lives. For Debbie, who had lived and breathed Blondie for nearly a decade, it was as if the floor dropped out from under her. In a matter of months, she lost her band, her livelihood, and nearly lost the man she loved. Debbie did what her conscience and heart dictated. She put her career on hold to care for Chris. For years, she virtually disappeared from the public eye. The woman who once strutted through Tokyo and Paris for photo shoots now spent her days in a New York hospital, holding Stein's hand as doctors fought to save him. It was a test of loyalty and character that few pop stars of her stature had ever faced. She and Chris were not married, but their bond was deep. She later called him one of the best things in my life, if not the very best. She fed him, helped him bathe, watched his weight drop and his spirits ebb and flow. Miraculously, Stein survived the worst of his illness, though recovery was slow. Harry's world, however, was plunged into chaos on other fronts. Unbeknownst to the band during their go-go years, their business manager had been playing fast and loose with finances. Taxes went unpaid on the band's income during their peak years. In the early 80s, as Blondie fell dormant, the IRS came knocking with a hefty bill. Debbie and Chris suddenly discovered they owed a fortune in back taxes. Money that they thought they had from record sales, touring, merchandising, all suddenly evaporated in a tangle of penalties and mismanagement. Chris got sick. Our financial manager did not pay our taxes. The bottom fell out, Harry recalled of that period. The elegant 5-story townhouse they had impulsively bought in Manhattan during the good days, complete with an elevator and a home studio for Chris, had to be sold. The unimaginable soon happened. We were totally broke and kicked out of our home, Debbie wrote. The IRS took everything they could lay their claws on. They took my car. They even took my coats, which was bizarre. What else could you be but broke when you've sold more than 40 million records? You're at the top of your career, and you've worked non-stop for 7 years with no vacation, she asked, the irony not lost on her. It was a classic rock and roll firestorm. 1 minute you're on top of the world, the next you're sleeping on a friend's couch, wondering where all the years and dollars went. Debbie herself had presciently said in one interview, at the peak of her fame, "It's easier to claw your way to the top than to stay there." Now those words came back to haunt her. For Debbie, the mid-1980s were the dark ages. She later admitted that during this period, both she and Chris were heavily addicted to heroin. The drug was a double-edged sword. It dulled the physical and emotional pain, but added its own weight of misery. Incredibly, Debbie even snuck heroin into the hospital for Chris. I think the doctors and nurses knew he was high all the time, but cast a blind eye because it kept him relatively pain-free and mentally less tortured. She wrote of that ethically murky decision. Looking back, Debbie doesn't flinch from the truth. "I was doing heroin," she said plainly. "I was taking a serious addictive substance. Actually, I should say, I was taking several serious addictive substances." Yet she refuses to paint herself simply as a victim of drugs. "I don't actually regret taking it," she reflected in one interview, "but I do regret the amount of time. It's a time consumer. But I think at that point it was a necessary evil. To some degree it was self-medicating. It was a rough, depressing time of life, and it seemed to suit the purpose, but then it outlived its benefit." Eventually, as the fog of crisis began to lift, Debbie found the strength to quit her addictions. "Just the way anybody does. Go to a program or go into therapy," she said. "It's not easy." Indeed, by the mid-80s, more than a few of Harry's contemporaries were casualties of drugs or illness. She saw friends like Johnny Thunders of the New York Dolls succumb. She watched the AIDS epidemic decimate the artistic community she belonged to. But Debbie Harry endured. By 1986, Chris Stein had recovered sufficiently to begin making music again, and he urged Debbie to do the same, with or without him. Their romantic relationship, strained by the ordeals of illness and addiction, quietly dissolved around 1987. Chris would eventually marry another woman in the 1990s. Debbie would later remark with a touch of pride that though she never married or had children, she'd had some intimacies and remained on good terms with her ex. They stayed friends and artistic collaborators, their bond more like family than former lovers. With Chris's encouragement, Debbie tentatively stepped back into the public sphere. She eased in by taking on a few acting roles, which had been an interest of hers since the early Blondie days. Her first foray had been a few years earlier, in fact. In 1983, she landed a lead role in David Cronenberg's surreal, disturbing film Videodrome. Playing a charismatic psychiatrist with a taste for sadomasochism, Debbie impressed critics with her eerie, cool detachment on screen. She carries herself with the wry, burned-out, but still titillated instincts of a voyager. One critic wrote, praising how Harry's presence grounds the film in acute, self-aware reality. The role showed a different side of Debbie Harry, not the kinetic rock singer, but a controlled, nuanced actress, unafraid to explore dark themes. She went on to appear in John Waters' campy hit Hairspray in 1988 as a villainous dance show queen. She was clearly delighting in the kitsch, and if you want to hear more about the mad world of John Waters, there's an entire Hollywood Mysteries episode all about him. I'll put a link in the description so you can have a gander after this one. Around the same time, she cautiously re-entered music as a solo artist. Adopting the name Deborah Harry to signal a perhaps more mature phase, she released the album Rockbird in 1986, which included a top 10 UK hit French Kissin' in the USA. A few years later came Deaf, Dumb and Blonde, a rather naughty title that reclaimed the dumb blonde stereotype and proved she still had plenty of pop mojo. Its single I Want That Man became a hit in Europe and Australia. Critics were mixed on these solo efforts. Some missed the classic Blondie sound, while others appreciated the willingness to try something new. But a commercial success in the US was modest at best. Debbie didn't chase stardom with the same hunger as during her younger days. She seemed to be feeling her way through, trying different sounds, working with younger artists and producers, seeing where she fit in a musical landscape that had shifted dramatically. After all, the late 80s and early 90s were the age of Madonna, MTV pop, and emerging alternative rock, already a long way from 1982. Indeed, the press often drew parallels between Harry and the new queen of pop Madonna, who had exploded onto the scene in the mid-80s with her own bottle blonde hair and downtown attitude. Some noted that Madonna's look and provocations owed a debt to Debbie's trailblazing. In any case, comparisons to Madonna were loose at best. Her real influence could be heard in the massively successful bands like No Doubt and Garbage from that time. She was content to remain something of a cult figure, an icon on a slightly smaller pedestal, where she could create on her own terms. As the 1990s progressed, Harry settled into her hard-won status as a new wave and punk rock elder stateswoman. She popped up in interesting places, collaborating with avant-garde jazz ensemble The Jazz Passengers, guesting on records with younger bands, and occasionally touring small venues where devoted fans, some now in their 30s or 40s, some college kids who discovered Blondie through older siblings, would thrill to see the legendary Blondie in the flesh. She had flame red hair for a while, always the chameleon, and leaned into her influence on the alternative culture. Then came the late 90s, which was an era of comebacks and reunions, and with it, an unlikely second act for Blondie. It started quietly with old bandmates talking again, a healing of some old wounds. In 1997, after some tentative contact, Debbie Harry, Chris Stein, drummer Clem Burke, and keyboardist Jimmy Destry, the core of Blondie's classic lineup, gathered in a room for the first time in 15 years. Time seemed to have softened the hard feelings and amplified the nostalgia. They joked about the old days, plugged in instruments, and found that the chemistry that had made Blondie special in the 70s was still there. The music flowed. What began as jam sessions turned into serious writing and recording. Some former members did not rejoin. Bassist Nigel Harrison and guitarist Frank Infante were left out, and they then filed an unsuccessful lawsuit to stop the band reforming under the name Blondie unless they were readmitted. Gary Valentine also filed papers against the band in a separate suit. But Blondie was moving forward with what made sense in the moment. In February 1999, Blondie released No Exit, their first new album since Reagan was president. Few could have predicted what happened next. The lead single Maria, a soaring power pop song that showcased Harry's voice in all its flirty, triumphant glory, shot to #1 in the United Kingdom. Debbie Harry was 53 years old singing Maria, You Gotta See Her, hitting the high notes like it was 1979 again. And suddenly, she and Blondie were back on top of the pops. Maria also hit #1 in 14 countries and climbed the US dance charts. Critics, some of whom had written Blondie off as a nostalgic act before they even heard the new material, had to admit the band had not only still got it, they had something fresh to say. Blondie found themselves playing arenas again, to crowds that included both middle-aged long-time fans and teenagers who just started digging the band thanks to No Exit. The mix of ages in the audience pleased Debbie. Blondie had always attracted a diverse following, and now a new generation was discovering the joy of their music. To her relief, their reunion shows were not just full of pogoing middle-aged dads. On stage, Harry still cut an arresting figure, now often with chic sunglasses and a shock of blonde hair against black outfits. If the once harshly dyed mop of hair was a bit more brittle, and the punk rock miniskirt sometimes gave way to more forgiving silhouettes, she was still a sight to behold. To underscore the point, Debbie has often recounted this anecdote. A friend once confessed that as a teen, he had a Blondie poster on his wall and became convinced that each day, the hem of Debbie's dress in the photo was getting shorter. A nuclear-grade 1970s adolescent fantasy, if ever there was one. Upon hearing this, Debbie howled with laughter, collapsing on a couch in a very undiva-like guffaw. She found it cool and endearing that hormonal young men were raising her skirt by sheer force of horny will. If Blondie's resurrection seemed like a fairy tale, not everything in the reunion was kumbaya and drum circles. In 2006, the band was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Now, this was a long-awaited honor. The ceremony at New York's Waldorf Astoria brought together past and present members. After Shirley Manson, of Garbage, delivered a rather gushing induction speech, calling Blondie one of the coolest, most glamorous, most stylish bands in the history of rock and roll, Debbie Harry, Chris Stein and Clem Burke took the stage alongside former comrades Nigel Harrison, Frank Infante and Gary Valentine for the acceptance. The atmosphere was peaceful, if not exactly friendly. Harry, Stein and Burke barely acknowledged their former bandmates. This peace lasted until Infante suddenly addressed Harry on the mic, pleading to perform one last time with the band on their hits. A chilly awkwardness fell. "Debbie, are we allowed?" Infante asked plaintively, as millions watched on television. Harry didn't miss a beat. With an icy stare, she shot back, "Can't you see my band is up there?" indicating the current Blondie lineup already on stage with instruments. Infante persisted. "Your band," he said. "I thought Blondie was being inducted," he muttered, clearly wounded. An audible groan went through the crowd. Harry simply turned away. The 3 excluded ex-members trudged off, leaving the victorious trio to play Heart of Glass and Call Me in celebration. They wrote themselves out of the band history, as far as I'm concerned, Chris Stein vented afterward, frustrated that what should have been a joyous night had momentarily devolved into drama. "This is supposed to be rock and roll. This is supposed to be friendly. This is like going through the trenches together." Stein sighed about his old bandmates' ill-timed confrontation. The incident made headlines, and yet it was proof that Blondie's saga, like the band's music, still had a punky edge. Debbie later expressed her disappointment, but characteristically shrugged it off as just another complication of a long, complicated career. Blondie forged on. The reunion stuck, and the band, with varying lineups around the core duo of Harry and Stein, continued to tour and record through the 2000s and 2010s. They put out the perhaps aptly titled The Curse of Blondie in 2003, which yielded a club hit, Good Boys, and kept experimenting with sounds, from electronica to reggae to pure pop. In 2011, they released Panic of Girls, and in 2014, Ghosts of Download. Debbie, or perhaps I should be calling her Deborah by now, also pursued a few side projects, never one to be idle. She released another solo album, Necessary Evil, in 2007. The world had changed radically since Blondie's first run. The internet, social media, streaming, but Deborah Harry moved with the times, even becoming active on the ungodly Twitter, for whatever that might be worth. In 2017, Blondie put out Pollinator, an album that smartly paired them with younger indie songwriters like Dev Hynes and Sia, who were die-hard Blondie fans. The album was widely praised, and in the UK it hit number 4 on the charts, which is honestly a quite remarkable achievement for a band over 40 years into its career. Even at that stage, she had nothing left to prove, yet still gave everything to the performance. She was stalking the stage in a glittering jacket and neon sunglasses, draping a cape that read "Stop fucking the planet" over her shoulders. The same rebel spirit, now fused with an elder's wisdom, drove her. In interviews around this time, Harry stressed how grateful she was to still be alive and making music. There have been times when I've had to face mortality, and as a person with strong survival instincts, I'm blessed in that way, she reflected. Indeed, the list of her brushes with death and danger is long. A childhood illness, the near abduction, the armed rape, drug overdoses narrowly avoided, stalkers, yes, she's had a few, not to mention the general self-destructive temptations of rock life. I know that I'm really lucky, and the longer I live, the more I know it, Harry said at age 74, keenly aware that many of her contemporaries, from David Bowie to her dear friend Joey Ramone, hadn't made it that far. In 2019, Debbie Harry published her memoir, fittingly titled Face It. In it, she laid bare many of the stories she once kept close to the vest: the rape during the burglary, her heroin years, the struggle of nursing Chris back to health, the financial ruin, and the slow climb back. Promoting the book, she spoke about these episodes without self-pity. You look back and you think about all the mistakes you made. Why did I ever do that? She said. But all in all, I guess I've been very lucky. Still, the luckiest moment was one that occurred in New York back in the mid-1970s. This was an era when visitors to the city were handed leaflets entitled A Survival Guide for Visitors to the City of New York as they disembarked from their flights. The guide pretty much told them to be indoors by 6 p.m. in any of the 5 boroughs. Smart tourists might have abided, but young New Yorkers had no such luxury. A peroxide blonde like Debbie would have been particularly at risk in that era of skyrocketing violent and often sexually violent crime. One mistake could be fatal, and Debbie made a terrible mistake. Here's how she described it almost 30 years after the incident. It was late at night and I was trying to get across Houston Street from the Lower East Side to 7th Avenue. For some reason, there were no cabs and I was wearing these big platform shoes. This car kept circling round and round. This guy was calling out, "Come on, I'll give you a ride." Finally, I gave in and got in the car. I realized that I'd made a big mistake. For one, it was very hot in the car and the windows rolled up nearly to the top. The guy had a white shirt and he was very good looking. Then I realised this guy had the worst BO I've ever smelt. Then I looked over at the door to crank down the window and saw there was no door handle, no crank. I cast my eyes around and saw that the car had been gutted. There was nothing in there. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. At that moment, she reached out of a gap in the passenger window and yanked the exterior handle to open the door. As soon as he saw that, he tried to turn the corner really fast, she said, and I spun out of the car and landed in the middle of the street. The good looks, the Volkswagen Beetle with those sinister modifications. A short while later, she came to the horrifying realization she had stepped into Ted Bundy's car and managed to escape by a whisker. Bundy was one of the most sadistic killers of young women in American history. He was convicted of 30 murders that took place between 1974 and 1978, before receiving the electric chair in 1989. Now in her late 70s, Debbie Harry has the aura of a survivor and a stateswoman of rock. The edgy platinum bob remains, though she'll casually cover it with a hoodie and sunglasses on a chilly day, strolling through New York, largely unnoticed by those who aren't in the know. She jokes that in her Chelsea neighborhood, the locals know her dogs' names, but not necessarily hers. That suits her fine. When I woke up this morning, I had a realization about myself, she said. I was always Blondie. What I realized is at some point I became Dirty Harry. I couldn't be Blondie anymore, so I became Dirty Harry. That was the secret of her duality, the blonde angel versus the streetwise fighter. Debbie's journey is far from over, but her legacy is already more than secure. She has carved out a singular place in music history, the punk kid who became a pop legend, the streetwise dreamer who, against all odds, keeps finding new ways to rip herself to shreds and stitch herself back together. Well, that's about your lot for this one. They don't get much greater than Debbie Harry, and we can count ourselves lucky to still have her around when you consider all the scrapes she got into. Anyway, let me know your favourite Blondie tune down in the comments. I'd love to chat about that. And be sure to subscribe so you get the next video nice and early. I've been Chester. See you then. Have a good one.